Well, good evening, everyone. It sure is good to see you all this evening. Yes, I will quickly tell you something about Scott. Scott's the only one, as far as I remember, that has not been here before of all the people who will be speaking on our summer series this year. But Scott is one of the guys who went to school with me at Brown Trail. He is an awesome guy. Of course, I said that about all the guys from Brown Trail, but I really, really appreciate Scott. I appreciate the style with which he presents God's Word. In terms of just, he usually comes at it from an angle that I really appreciate, that I really haven't thought of, that's thought-provoking. So anyway, I haven't gotten to see him very often since we graduated, and I'm really, really excited for him to be able to come and speak. So make sure, if at all possible, that you're able to be there Wednesday night, because that'll be a good lesson, I can assure you. All right, we are continuing with our study of background history, if you will. Things that are happening in the background of the Bible. Once again, comments, questions, all that is very welcome as we go through this study. We are looking at things that, in part, things that happened while parts of the Bible are happening, if you will. So you have the events of the Bible going on here, but we're getting some background of what's going on in the world at large and different empires rising and falling. But if you remember last week, or 2 weeks ago, I guess, last week was potluck. 2 weeks ago, last time we talked about the Persian Empire. We talked about how under Assyria and Babylon, Israel has been carried away into captivity, but under Persia, because of their different policy in terms of conquered people, they were allowed to go back. That's why Israel and a bunch of other nations also were allowed to go back to their homelands, is because Persia had a different philosophy of how to handle this. You let people go back to their homelands after they've been taken away, they'll like us better, they'll be more loyal, they won't cause as much trouble. And so, therefore, you have Israel going back. We have the records in Ezra and Nehemiah, for example, of them rebuilding the temple. They rebuild the wall of Jerusalem. You have in Esther, King Xerxes, as he is ruling and going to war with Greece. We kind of talked about that a little bit in the background. And you have Esther, of course, interacting with Xerxes, or Ahasuerus in some translations. All that is under the Persian Empire. We also talked about how the Persian Empire was a much more stable empire in many ways than the Assyrian and Babylonian empires and many other empires that have existed. The Assyrian and Babylonian empires did not last very long, often had one or two pretty notable kings, but most of the others didn't really do a whole lot. Persia lasted for about 200 years, depending on how you reckon it, maybe over that a little bit, and had several notable kings, had a huge, expansive empire, accomplished a whole lot. And that is where the Bible, at least the Old Testament, ends, with Persia being the ones in charge. As far as timeline, as far as when the books of the Bible were written, now you'll have some people who dispute this, but I think that the evidence is very convincing to me anyway. The last book of the Bible is written several decades before the end of the Persian Empire. So once the Bible finishes, or the Old Testament again, once the Old Testament finishes being written, the Persian Empire is still in control. So now, as we start tonight and for the next few weeks, moving into the time of the New Testament, we're going to be talking about that period in between. How did we get from Persia being in charge to all of a sudden Rome being in charge once the New Testament begins? And why is it important for us to know that? Because there are a whole lot of things that happen in the world at large, and specifically as they affected Israel, that really changed how Jews thought about the world, how Jews thought about their own religion, about the Messiah, and just a lot that will be helpful for us as we move through. But this is the time in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, so there's not as much that we're going to see in Scripture that directly references it, although there are some things that we're going to see that are referenced even so, and we'll understand what we mean in a second. So tonight we're going to talk about one person. There are not many instances in all of this stuff that we're going to discuss where we're going to spend a whole night just on one person. But he, I hate to say deserves it, because he wasn't exactly a moral person, but he deserves it in the sense of the impact that he had. There are a lot of kings and conquerors and so forth that have been called the Great. That's like a very common thing to tack on the end of somebody's name, right? So-and-so the Great. But when we talk about Alexander the Great, there's a reason, unlike some of the others, why he is called Alexander the Great. He accomplished something that virtually no one else was able to accomplish in terms of conquest, in terms of, for lack of a better term, taking over the world at that time. Now, not the whole world in the sense that maybe we would think of today, but a large chunk of the world in, I'm trying to think, 6 years, 8 years? Very, very short amount of time. He died when he was, spoiler alert, he died when he was very young. So he accomplished everything he accomplished in a very short amount of time. But as we look at Alexander the Great and what he accomplished tonight for just a few minutes, I want us to specifically focus on why these things are relevant for us to know. This isn't just history for the sake of history, although y'all know I wouldn't have any problem with that, right? But this is history that is going to help us very much seeing the sequence of events that are going to shape not just the world in general, but the world as it relates to God's people in Israel and as the Messiah is getting closer and closer to being born. So Alexander the Great, we go back to remembering this Persian Empire, right? This Persian Empire that's big, it's large, it's stable, it's been around for a couple hundred years. It controls this whole territory through through Egypt, all the way through Canaan and that area, Phoenicia, of course Persia itself, Media, Asia Minor, what we now call Turkey, and even parts of Greece eventually fell to the Persians, although with those famous battles like the Battle of Thermopylae and Marathon, the Greeks were able to hold out. That's what those movies like 300 are about, is the Greeks never fully were conquered by Persia. But nonetheless, Persia becomes very, very powerful. And they're constantly trying to expand their borders like any good empire does, right? We always want to be bigger. We always want to be more powerful. But even though they were able to expand in all these different directions, they never could quite take over the West to the degree they wanted to. They kept on pushing into areas like Macedonia and Greece, but they could never quite get a firm foothold in that entire region. They only got a few cities, as you can kind of see on the map here. If you look up here, this is Greece. You see, whoops, went forward a little. You see this area right here. They got a few of the cities under their control, but they don't have the whole thing. They never were able to fully conquer Greece. That was the goal of many kings of Persia. That was their thing. That was their pet project. We talked about Xerxes and Esther, right? That's his thing. He wants to conquer Greece. And he comes home defeated, and that's why he wants a bunch of women, ultimately, is because he wants something to soothe his, tail between his legs spirit, if you will, for being beaten so soundly by the Greeks. Well, eventually, the tables start to turn. Because you have the Greeks beginning to get some ideas of their own. Now, when we talk about ideas for the Greeks, the first thing we need to realize is that the Greeks are not just getting ideas in terms of becoming more powerful as a military force and things like that. Greece developed a whole lot in the area of culture. This is a depiction. I try to be very careful. When you start getting into depictions of Greece, you have to be really careful about, how shall we say, not nakedness, right? But anyway, I tried in all these to be mindful of that. But you have all these depictions, or rather all these improvements, all these developments in Greece in particular when it came to culture. You have major philosophers who are beginning to arise and kind of start this idea of Western philosophy, as we, even now, today, still kind of pull from their ideas. People like Aristotle and Socrates and Plato. You have the Greeks kind of formulating a very, how should we say, approachable form of religion in terms of the way they crafted their pantheons, the way they crafted their Greek gods and mythologies and all that. I'm not saying any of that was good or pleasing God. I'm saying from a human perspective, it was rather appealing and people could kind of latch onto it and kind of get on board with it, even if it wasn't what they had been raised with. It was something they could kind of be integrated into. So you have Greece kind of becoming more and more a center of culture. These are the sophisticated people of the ancient world. More and more that becomes kind of the environment. But even with all that happening, they still are being invaded constantly by Persia. And finally, they just decide, I don't really want to deal with that. Here's the problem, though. For centuries, Greece couldn't unite. You notice this map. You have Persia over here and some of Persia's different conquerings. But notice all these different colors over here. All this is like Greece and Macedonia and stuff. Why do you think those are all different colors, all in the same area of Greece? Do what? Different controllers. And they didn't get along. For example, you have what is called the Peloponnesian War. I know that's a mouthful, but that's what it was called. I really don't actually know why. I'm sure it's named after some place or something like that. But the Peloponnesian Wars were this massive set of wars between Athens and her allies and Sparta and her allies, two of the major cities in the area of Greece. And so Athens and Sparta are constantly at each other's throats. You have all these other city-states and regions who are siding with one side or the other, or just bickering on their own, trying to get more power, more territory, more influence. And while they all share the same basic culture and these same basic roots, they just are constantly at each other's throats. And so while that lasts, they don't do very well against the Persians. They keep Persia from taking over the whole area, but they can't really do much beyond that because they're not united. Until you get Macedonia getting some big ideas. Now, we talk about Greece being cultured. Macedonia was kind of the ugly stepchild, if you will. They were the backwoods area of Greece. They weren't the most cultured of all the areas of Greece. If you want culture, you go to Athens. If you want, warrior society, you go to Sparta. But Macedon, they weren't thought of just a whole lot. I'm going to say this just stereotypically, not trying to be rude, but kind of how some Texans think about Oklahoma. Kind of like, our backyard kind of thing. That's kind of how Macedon was for Greece. Maybe that helps us kind of get an idea, all right? So, Macedon is kind of just the nobody. That's not where anybody important is going to come from. But eventually, that all changes. This guy is Philip II specifically, of Macedon. He was king of Macedon, and he has a goal. No, his ultimate goal was outside of Greece. He wanted, just like everybody else, to attack Persia, just like Persia had been attacking them. But first, he recognized you can't do that if we're all fighting amongst each other. So Philip starts taking the first steps to actually begin to unite Greece under Macedonian rule. Now, when you read unite Greece, think conquer Greece, right? But still, that's how you think of it. We're going to get all of Greece together under one banner, and then we'll actually begin to be strong enough to invade other places like, for example, Persia and all the damage they have done to us. So Philip starts engaging in the political and military campaigns to try and get different Greek city-states on his side, to get them to be loyal to him, all these different things. And he is remarkably successful in the time that he is able to do all this in getting a lot of Greece united behind him and kind of putting Macedon at the forefront of the political situation in Greece. And then, of course, he gets assassinated, like all successful people eventually do, it seems, right? He gets assassinated in the middle of all of these efforts. And so his son takes over. Of course, his son, his name is Alexander. Alexander takes over, I believe he was about 20 years old when he takes over. And of course, since this whole Greece being united thing is kind of new, the Greeks are like, well, Philip's dead. Maybe we don't need Macedon anymore. And so the first thing Alexander has to do is he has to reestablish, no, you're still mine. You still have to follow me. All of Greece still needs to respect my authority as the new king. He has to deal with that for a little while, but like his father, his ultimate goal is to lash back out against Persia. However, he is not a typical person when it comes to his aspirations. Anyone familiar with the Iliad and the Odyssey? What are those? Somebody tell us. Do what? Epic poems. They are written by a man named Homer, a Greek. They are considered, even today, some of the most, how shall we put this, articulate and influential works of literature in just about the entirety of the ancient world. If you go and read them, and especially depending on the translation, it's kind of hard to follow because, of course, they write differently than we do, but especially the Odyssey is actually really impressive. I read it one time just kind of for fun. I know I'm a nerd. But I read it one time just kind of for fun, just to see what it was, and the Odyssey is actually pretty cool. Now, of course, it's got all their religion and stuff packed into it, but just in terms of a story, it's quite fascinating and impressive that, you have someone, we're talking 800 BC when this was written approximately, and you have someone compiling all this and putting this together. I understand why it had such an influence, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Well, Alexander loves those kinds of things. Whenever he went on his military campaigns, he would keep a copy of the Odyssey or the Iliad, I can't remember which one, under his pillow as a reminder of who he wants to be. He wants to be one of these heroes, one of these amazing people who accomplishes these great deeds of valor. That's the kind of person that he is setting himself up to be. Incidentally, he also had a very prestigious tutor, none other than Aristotle himself. Aristotle was Alexander's personal tutor as a young child. And again, if we don't quite understand how much influence Aristotle had, Aristotle was the prominent, the really only authoritative voice in the sciences and philosophy and all those kind of things for centuries, even up past the Roman Empire. People were still looking to Aristotle, and even today he still has a great deal of influence in terms of some of his basic ideas and philosophies. Even though, of course, in terms of some of the specifics, we have all sorts of scientific technology and whatnot, he still was very influential, even in terms of some modern ideas. So that's the background that Alexander is coming from. He's not just interested in politics for politics' sake, in power for power's sake. He wants to be a hero, if you will. He wants to be a conqueror. He wants to be, in terms of the world of the time, great. He wants to be the type of person that a man like Homer would write stories and epic poems about. And so he starts by conquering, or reconquering, I should say, Greece, making sure Greece is going to be loyal to him. But again, his ultimate goal, they've been under attack by Persia for so long. Persia's kept on trying to invade, and eventually the Greeks are tired of it, and they want their turn. They want to lash back out against Persia. And Alexander thinks he's going to be the one who's going to do it. So he begins to get together his army and all these kind of things, and he actually, really, for the time, doesn't have just a ridiculously huge army. For most of his campaign, he has about 50,000 soldiers, best we can account for, which, when we were talking about ancient battles and so forth, you can get into 100,000, even more, in your army. So this is not just crazy impressive in terms of the size, but his army was very impressive for a couple of different reasons. Number one, you can kind of see it depicted here. This is a kind of zoomed out version of the mosaic that we had up there in the beginning. You see those really long spears there? Now, it's hard to tell in a mosaic like this which side is being depicted where and so forth and so on. I believe this is supposed to be one of the major battles, the Battle of Issus, between Alexander and Persia. But nonetheless, these spears kind of help us to understand something about Alexander's army. For the time, Alexander's army was very advanced in terms of their technology. They had extra long, flexible spears called sarissas, and they would use these in a very formidable formation called the phalanx. It was a very disciplined, orderly formation. They would group together, they would have these spears leveled toward the enemy, and then behind you'd have another person with spears slightly angled up, and then angled up, and then angled up. And so if you ever try and charge cavalry at a phalanx, you're just going to get impaled like crazy. If you try and charge infantry in, well, that spear wall is going to hold pretty well. You're going to have to kind of shimmy between, but then since it's flexible, you're not going to have as easy a time breaking the spears apart or the sarissas apart. You're going to be peppered with arrows from behind the phalanx. It was a very well-organized, well-equipped force for the time, and that was part of what Alexander was relying on. And so he puts this army together. He's got a lot of these pikemen. He also has a lot of really good cavalry. And he begins, slowly but surely, to move through what is now Turkey and eventually into what we now call Asia, or what we think of like the Middle East and Asia and so forth. And he is met with resistance several times. He has to lay siege to several cities. He has to do battle in several places. But the second thing, beyond the phalanx and armament and discipline of his forces, is that Alexander was quite frankly, a brilliant general. He was very well adept at reading his opponent's mind, if you will, understanding the psychology of battle, not just the practical aspects of it. And so he is able, with a relatively small force, at least by some accounts, and with a lot of odds against him, I mean, tiny little area of Macedon and Greece that he controls against this massive Persian army, as we saw on the map, just, probably millions, if I had to guess, of acres. I don't know exactly, or square miles, I don't know exactly how large it would have been. But you have just a massive, massive empire that is opposing him, and yet battle after battle, he consistently wins. Eventually, the king of Persia in person tries to oppose him, and we have that first major battle, the Battle of Issus, and Alexander, once again, very handily wins that battle. He goes on to conquer areas like Jerusalem and Tyre, which we'll talk about in a second, and parts of the Middle East, goes into Egypt, and then he goes back, moving further east, and he again meets the king, King Darius III, at the Battle of Gaugamela. He is outnumbered at least 2-1. A lot of the ancient historians who like Alexander said it was like 10-1, but it's probably more like 2-1. But nonetheless, he's outnumbered at least 2-1 with a very well-equipped army, by the way. And again, being an excellent general, he routs the entire army and essentially has all of the Persian Empire before him. So bottom line, I know we're going into a lot of detail here, bottom line, Alexander, through both his army and his own skill as general, is able to essentially, in a decade or less, wipe out, or at least replace with himself and his own government. He's able to take out the entire Persian Empire that has existed for 2,000 years. This is a basic map of where Alexander conquers. All the way, as you can see, from Greece up here, crosses over into Asia Minor. This was all Persian. He takes all that over, goes down here into Egypt, takes all this over, I'm sorry about that black square, I couldn't figure out how to get rid of it. Goes over here into the east, takes Nineveh, Babylon, Susa, all the way to the borders of India is how far Alexander goes. He only stops because his army finally says, "We're tired, give us a break." That's literally the only reason he stops. It is a massive feat. If we want to talk about trying to make a name for yourself, trying to be someone that people would want to emulate, trying to be someone that people are going to write songs and poems about, well, he certainly accomplished that. Now, we say all that. We also say this happens after the Old Testament is written. That doesn't mean there's not any references to it in the Old Testament, however. Notice in Daniel, as Daniel is predicting through prophecy, through inspiration, some of the things that are going to happen after this, notice what Daniel says. As I was considering, this is a vision that he has, behold, a male goat came from the west, across the face of the whole earth. Think west, that would be Greece, Rome, that area, right? A male goat comes from the west, across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. Now, we've talked a little in Revelation. What does a horn usually represent? When you have beasts with horns on them, what do the horns usually represent? Usually it's a king. This one has one conspicuous horn between his eyes. That's interesting. But notice, he came to the ram with two horns. Now we're going to see in a second, this ram represents a different empire, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal. He ran at him in his powerful wrath, and the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground. Interesting, interesting. But Daniel's not just going to leave us there. The vision, or the angel giving him the vision, is going to explain the vision to him. Then the goat became exceedingly strong. When he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it, there came up four conspicuous horns toward the four winds of heaven. All right, help us out, angel who is giving this vision to Daniel. What does this mean? Well, we continue on in the chapter. The ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. Okay, so the ram, the one that gets beaten by the goat, that's Media and Persia. That's the Persian Empire, and of course Media was part of the Persian Empire. They worked together. And the goat is the king of Greece. and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. Well, in terms of any kind of power, any kind of influence on the world stage, there's only one person that could be: Alexander. So we actually see in Daniel a prophecy of Alexander the Great and the kingdom of Greece conquering the kingdom of Persia, or the empire of Persia. Very, very interesting. Remember, Daniel is written shortly after the Persian Empire takes out Babylon, or at least the events in Daniel take place shortly after the Persians take out Babylon. So we're talking at least 150 years or so before Alexander the Great is even born, and this prophecy is being made about what's going to happen. Very interesting. Notice something else, though, as we are beginning to wrap up. I just want to kind of summarize. We could talk a lot. I've been watching a video, just, again, kind of for fun, about Alexander the Great's conquest and stuff. Every once in a while, Alyssa will walk back there and she'll hear some British voice being, "Alexander's forces crossed the blah, blah, blah." And she's like shaking her head. All right. Now, as Alexander is marching through here, this is Israel over here, right? This is the Tigris and Euphrates River, so this is the Fertile Crescent we talked about a lot. Whoops, lost my earpiece. Fertile Crescent we've been talking about a lot, and, well, it's not going to cooperate with me. There we go. And then we have here this area right here. This is Israel. As Alexander comes down through here, he comes to this city called Tyre. Now, Tyre is very interesting. It is where the Carthaginian Empire would eventually come from. We'll talk about them at a later time. But it is also a city that, to my knowledge, at least in completeness, has never been conquered. And there's a reason for that. They have a lot of harbors and all these things, but they also have two parts of their city. They have a city on the mainland, right, on the coast, but there's an island just off of that mainland, and they've built the other part of their city there. So what do you think they do if someone comes and tries to attack them? Well, they probably try and defend a little bit on the mainland, but if that doesn't work, well, they just go to the island. Well, how do you attack an island? Well, you got to have ships. Well, guess who was one of the best people at naval warfare at the time? Tyre. So your ships aren't going to do much good because they have really good ships. They have really good naval tactics, all these kind of things. So no one ever successfully fully conquers the city of Tyre. Nebuchadnezzar tries, but he only conquers the mainland area, not the island city. Let's put this back on here. All right. But we have something that's interesting whenever we get to Ezekiel. As Ezekiel is prophesying, notice what he says. "Therefore, thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, O Tyre, and will bring up many nations against you, as the sea brings up its waves." Notice, verse 12. "They will plunder your riches and loot your merchandise. They will break down your walls and destroy your pleasant houses. Your stones, your timber, your soil, they will cast into the midst of the waters." Now, we might read that, and we might say, okay, they're going to, destroy them. We got to remember, in ancient times, you don't have easy access to a lot of resources. You don't just throw away stone and timber. You use that stuff because there's not much of it, at least in terms of easy to get. You reuse it. Now, you may tear it down, but then you build it back up. You don't throw it into the ocean. You would never do something like that. Well, how do you conquer an island? Alexander approaches Tyre. Tyre tries to make a deal with him, basically saying, let us just be neutral. We won't attack you, but we also won't, side with the Persians or whatever. And Alexander knows, that's not going to work, because as soon as Darius shows up, he's going to try the same thing, and they'll be like, oh, yeah, we'll serve you, and we'll let you come in and land troops behind Alexander. So he needs to take Tyre. But how is he going to take Tyre? Nebuchadnezzar tried. All he was able to do was attack the mainland. Well, Alexander tells the officials of Tyre, well, I'm going to make your city part of the mainland. So what he does, he attacks the mainland part of the city. He wipes it clean, telling all of his soldiers to take every piece of timber and stone from the city, tear it down, you carry it over, and you throw it into the sea. But not just in any haphazard way. You throw it in the sea to make a land bridge. basically you throw all this stuff in the water, and then you could walk across it to the island. Now, it took a while, and it was hard work for him to do it. The people of Tyre, they tried to attack with ships and all these kind of things, but eventually he makes a land bridge all the way from the mainland to the island, and he levels the city of Tyre and executes most of the population as well for their defiance. Isn't that interesting that that basic reference to how Tyre would be destroyed is prophesied earlier on in Ezekiel? So we have references, the point of this is we have references to Alexander the Great, even though those references are written, not during the time of Alexander the Great. Honestly, that just makes it even more impressive, because then they're predictions even before these things have happened. So this all takes place after the last book of the Bible, or book of the Old Testament rather, has been written, but there are still references to him. Now, the interesting thing about Alexander, as we talked about in Daniel, right? Remember that great horn is broken? Alexander dies when he's only 33 years old. Now, there's different speculations about why he died. Some people think he was poisoned. Some people think he drank himself to death because, well, I won't go into why. It's kind of disgusting. But anyway, some people think that he was, just got some kind of fever or something like that, or one of his wounds maybe got infected. I don't know. There's all sorts of theories out there as to why he died so young. The bottom line is he conquers all this area, and then he dies. Well, he's the only one holding this whole thing together. Now, who knows how long he could have held it together if he had survived, but once he dies, things are going to change very quickly. We're going to get into that more as we look next week. But here's the thing to remember. If you have someone conquering that degree of territory in that short a time, and this person is also someone of a different culture, which is a culture that is beginning more and more to be recognized as the dominant, sophisticated culture in the ancient world. These are the fancy people, if you will, the philosophers, the thinkers, and so forth. And that's the nation, the people that conquer. Well, they're going to carry some of that culture with them. And that's going to have a huge impact on what happens next. As Alexander marches, he begins spreading Greek culture. He begins encouraging people to speak the Greek language so everyone he conquers can communicate, can trade. He establishes currency that will be kind of a standard currency, so all these different nations can begin to trade with one another across this whole empire. And that's only going to continue after his death. Even though he's dead, the Greek influence that he begins is going to continue. And guess what our New Testaments are written in? They're written in Greek. That's no accident. We're going to continue to see the aftermath next time. But that is why we begin to see the influence of Greek culture across the world. And that's going to play a huge role in the development of, ultimately, the environment of the New Testament. So, despite this short lifespan, he has a huge impact, Alexander does, on the Mediterranean world, and he begins building the foundation for what will ultimately be the cultural environment of Jesus' day. How does that all work? Well, you'll have to wait till next week for that. But that's a brief summary. We could talk a whole lot, like I always say, and there's all sorts of stuff that I love talking about history. But any questions or comments as we wrap up for this evening? All right. Well, y'all can wake up from your naps now. We're done. If there is anything we can help y'all with this evening in terms of praying for one another, in terms of anything like that, we always want to be there to support and pray for one another. We always want to offer that opportunity. So if there is something, please let us know as we stand and sing together.
Hark the gentle voice of
Jesus falleth tenderly